The crystal champagne flute felt like ice in Brian's hand as her husband Richard stood on the grand stage, beaming under the spotlight of the annual Croft Holdings Gala. He was supposed to be accepting the Executive of the Year award. Instead, he wrapped his arm around a young woman from his marketing department, a woman whose lingering perfume Brian had smelled on his suits for months. Then, with a voice full of false sincerity, he uttered the words that shattered the elegant ballroom's silence and her entire world. "And I can't accept this without sharing a piece of personal news. My future is finally clear. I want you all to meet my fiancée, Isabella." The gasps were a physical wave crashing through the room. But as they all stared at the publicly humiliated wife, they didn't know the real secret. They saw a woman scorned. They had no idea they were actually watching an employee attempting to fire his own boss. Brian Andrea lived a life that was from the outside the epitome of quiet luxury. Her home, a sprawling modern masterpiece in the hills overlooking the city, was a testament to taste and wealth. Its clean lines and vast glass walls were her design, a remnant of her past life as a promising architect before she had set it all aside. She had married Richard Andrea 10 years ago, a man whose ambition was as sharp and gleaming as the chrome fixtures in their kitchen. He was charming, intelligent, and possessed a relentless drive that had propelled him up the corporate ladder at Croft Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and development conglomerate. To everyone, they were the perfect couple: Richard, the charismatic vice president of business development, and Brian, the graceful, supportive wife who chaired charities and hosted flawless dinner parties. But for the last year, the perfect facade had begun to crack, revealing a cold, hollow space within. The cracks started as hairline fractures, late nights at the office that stretched until 2 a.m., business trips over weekends with flimsy justifications and a new cloying scent, a mix of vanilla and something overtly floral that clung to his shirts. It was the little things that screamed the loudest. The way his phone was always screen down on the nightstand. The sudden password protection on his laptop, which had always been open between them. The emotional distance that had grown into a chasm, with his compliments feeling rehearsed, and his touch, when it came, feeling like a contractual obligation. Brian was not a fool. She was the daughter of Harrison Croft, the formidable founder of Croft Holdings. She had grown up reading blueprints instead of fairy tales, and listening to boardroom negotiations instead of lullabies. Her mind was analytical, trained to see structural weaknesses. She saw them now, not in a building, but in her own marriage. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, her suspicions found a name. A misplaced credit card statement carelessly left on the mahogany desk in Richard's home office. Tucked between charges for expensive client dinners was a recurring one she didn't recognize: Fiore and Pearl. A quick search revealed it was an obscenely expensive lingerie boutique downtown. Further down, a charge for a 2-night stay at a boutique hotel, the Oriana. On a weekend he was supposedly at a conference in Chicago. A hollow ache settled in her chest. She didn't confront him. What would be the point? He was a masterful liar, capable of weaving tales so convincing he could sell swampland as a luxury resort. An emotional confrontation would only give him the chance to gaslight her, to call her crazy, to retreat further into his web of deceit. Her father had taught her many things, but the most important was this: never play a hand until you have all the cards. Her father, Harrison, had passed away 2 years prior, leaving behind a legacy of steel and concrete. What very few people knew, a secret guarded by ironclad NDAs and the family's longtime attorney, Arthur Sterling, was that Harrison had left his entire controlling interest, 51% of Croft Holdings, to his only child. Not to Richard, his brilliant son-in-law, but to Brian. Harrison had been old school. He believed a woman's place wasn't necessarily in the home, but he also didn't believe in handing over power without it being earned. His will stipulated that the current CEO, his trusted friend Arthur, would manage the company and mentor Brian until she was ready to take the reins, or until she chose to exercise her power as majority shareholder. Richard knew she had inherited a substantial fortune, but he believed it was all tied up in a blind trust. He had no idea that every memo, every quarterly report, every major decision made at Croft Holdings ultimately had to pass by the desk of the woman he dismissed as his domestically inclined wife. He thought she was just a wealthy heiress. He had no clue she was his boss. Brian had been content to remain in the shadows, observing, learning from Arthur, and waiting for the right moment to step into her father's shoes. She had loved Richard, or at least the man she thought he was. She had wanted to support his career, believing his success was their success. Now his betrayal had become the catalyst. He hadn't just cheated on his wife. He had disrespected the legacy of the Croft name. He was using the resources of her company to fund his affair. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place a week later. A company newsletter was emailed to her, a courtesy copy Arthur ensured she received. It featured a Rising Stars section. There, smiling out from the page, was a junior marketing analyst named Isabella Rossi. Young, ambitious, beautiful. The caption praised her work on the new Phoenix Tower project, Richard's pet project. Brian zoomed in on the photo. Around Isabella's neck was a delicate gold necklace with a small pearl pendant, a new arrival on the Fiorian Pearl website. The cold ache in her chest solidified into something hard and resolute. Ice. Richard wasn't just having an affair. He was building a new life with a subordinate right under her nose, using her own money. The upcoming annual gala and night, meant to celebrate the company's achievements, suddenly presented itself as the perfect stage. It was time for everyone, especially Richard, to learn who Brian Andrea truly was. The invitation arrived a week before the gala. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with the Croft Holdings logo embossed in gold. It was addressed to Mr. Richard Andrea, Biz Brian Andrea. When Richard handed it to her over breakfast, his casualness was a performance. The annual gala is next Saturday. Darling, he said, not looking up from his tablet where the stock market tickers scrolled endlessly. Big night. They're giving me the Executive of the Year award. He finally glanced up, a practiced smile on his face. You don't have to come, of course. I know these things bore you. There it was. The out. The carefully constructed escape hatch for him. For years she had often declined, preferring a quiet evening to the forced schmoozing and corporate back-patting. He was counting on her to do the same now. Brian picked up her coffee cup, her hand perfectly steady. Oh, I don't know, Richard. Executive of the Year. That sounds important. I think I should be there to support you. A flicker of something panic maybe crossed his eyes before being instantly suppressed. Of course, I know you don't enjoy it. It'll be a late night full of boring speeches. I think I can manage for one night, she replied, her voice light, betraying none of the steel solidifying around her heart. I'll need a new dress. His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Wonderful. Get something beautiful. My treat. With my money, she thought. The moment he left for work, the pretense of a normal morning shattered. Brian walked into her private study, a room Richard rarely entered, and locked the door. On her screen was a secure video call. The face that appeared was that of Arthur Sterling, the CEO of Croft Holdings. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes that belied a mind as sharp as a razor. He had been her father's right-hand man, and was now her staunchest ally. "He took the bait," Arthur Bryan said, her voice low and firm. Arthur sighed, adjusting his glasses. "I had a feeling he would. His arrogance is his Achilles' heel. The entire senior leadership is buzzing about him and Miss Rosie. He's not even being discreet anymore. He thinks he's untouchable." "He is," Bryan said coldly. "Until next Saturday." For the past few weeks, Bryan and Arthur had been meticulously planning. It wasn't just about exposing an affair. It was about surgically excising a cancer from her company. With Arthur's help, she had initiated a quiet, high-level internal audit of Richard's department conducted by an external firm to ensure absolute secrecy. The preliminary audit results came in this morning. Bryan Arthur said, his tone turning serious. "It's worse than we thought. He's been funneling money through shell corporations disguised as marketing consultants. One of them is registered to Isabella Rossi's brother. He's been padding expense reports on the Phoenix Tower project to the tune of nearly $3 million. Bryan felt a wave of nausea quickly replaced by white-hot anger. This wasn't just infidelity. This was theft, a betrayal on a scale she hadn't even imagined. He was stealing from her father's legacy, from the employees who depended on the company from her. "Print it all," she commanded. "Have a full dossier ready for me. I want every fake invoice, every illegal wire transfer. We're not just firing him, Arthur. We're destroying him." "It will be ready," Arthur assured her. "And the board." "The board answers to the majority shareholder," Bryan stated, a new authority in her voice that would have shocked Richard. "And on Saturday night, they will meet her." Their plan was simple, yet audacious. Bryan would attend the gala, not as the mousy wife, but as a silent observer. Arthur would handle the award ceremony. Richard, puffed up with his own importance, would be given enough rope to hang himself. And when he was at his most arrogant, most triumphant, Bryan would step from the shadows and reclaim everything. The rest of the week was a surreal exercise in duplicity. Bryan played the part of the dutiful wife, discussing dress colors and congratulating Richard on his upcoming award. She chose a gown of deep emerald green, a color of rebirth and money, tailored to fit her perfectly. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly unforgettable. While she was at fittings, her mind was on spreadsheets and legal documents. Richard, meanwhile, grew more confident. He assumed Bryan's decision to attend was a weak attempt to keep an eye on him, a gesture he found more pathetic than threatening. He was already planning his future, a future with a younger, more adoring woman on his arm, and he believed a clear path to the CEO position once Arthur Sterling retired. He was so busy looking at the throne, he never thought to check who already owned the kingdom. The night before the gala, he came home with a small velvet box. Inside was a pair of diamond earrings. "For my beautiful wife," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "To wear tomorrow night, so you can shine." Bryan let him fasten them on her, his cold fingers brushing against her neck. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The diamonds were brilliant, but her eyes were like chips of ice. "Thank you, Richard," she said. Her voice a perfect imitation of gratitude. "They're perfect." She knew they were purchased with stolen funds. They felt like tiny, cold shackles. Tomorrow, she would break them. The imperial ballroom was a sea of black ties, glittering gowns, and the clinking of champagne glasses. The air hummed with the self-important chatter of the city's corporate elite. Croft Holdings' annual gala was the event of the season, a testament to the company's power and influence. Chandeliers dripped crystals from the ceiling, casting a golden glow on the hundreds of attendees. Richard, preening in a custom-tailored tuxedo, stood near the entrance, accepting congratulations with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was king. He kept glancing towards the door, a nervous energy thrumming beneath his polished exterior. He was waiting for Isabella. He had told her to make a quiet entrance to meet him by the terrace bar. His wife, he assumed, would arrive on his arm, a pretty but ultimately forgettable accessory. He was wrong. A hush fell over the cluster of executives by the grand staircase. A woman had just arrived. She paused at the top of the stairs, surveying the room not with the timid uncertainty of a +1, but with the quiet authority of an owner. She wore an emerald green gown that seemed to drink the light. It flowed around her, accenting a figure that years of polite society had learned to overlook. Her hair, usually in a simple chignon, was styled in elegant waves that cascaded over one shoulder. The diamond earrings Richard had given her glittered at her ears, but her most striking accessory was the look in her eyes. Cool, appraising, and utterly in command. It took the room a moment to recognize her. It was Brian Andrea, but it was not the Brian they knew. This was not the quiet, smiling wife who faded into the background at charity events. This was a different woman entirely. Richard tore her, and for a second his composure cracked. His smile faltered, and his glass of champagne stilled halfway to his lips. This was not the woman he had expected. He had anticipated a somber, slightly frumpy Brian he could park at a table in the back. This vision in green was a complication. She descended the staircase, her movements fluid and graceful. People parted for her, their whispers following in her wake. "Is that Brian Andrea? My God, I didn't even recognize her. Look at that dress." She walked directly towards Richard. His politician's smile snapped back into place. "Brian, darling, you look astonishing." He leaned in to kiss her cheek, but she offered it with a regal coldness that stopped him short. "Good evening, Richard," she said, her voice clear and calm, yet carrying a new unfamiliar timbre. "It's quite a party." Of course, the best for the best, he boasted, recovering his swagger. He tried to take her arm to possess her, to bring this unexpected new version of her under his control. "Let me get you a drink. I've saved us a table right at the front." "No, thank you," Brian replied smoothly, taking a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. "You have people to talk to, an award to accept. Don't let me get in your way. I think I'll just mingle." Before he could protest, she turned and walked away, melting into the crowd. Richard was left standing there, momentarily thrown. Her refusal to be managed to be his appendage for the evening was unsettling, but he quickly dismissed it. She was just putting on a brave face, he told himself, a pathetic little show of defiance before the inevitable. He checked his watch. Isabella would be here any minute. Brian, meanwhile, moved through the room with purpose. She exchanged pleasantries with board members and senior executives, men who saw her as little more than Richard's wife. To Marcus Thorne, the perpetually skeptical head of acquisitions, she asked a pointed question about a recent merger that made him blink in surprise at her insight. To the CFO, she made a quiet comment about appreciating his conservative approach to the third-quarter projections, a detail Richard would have never thought she'd know. She wasn't just mingling. She was taking inventory sponsoring. She was letting them really see her for the first time. Her eyes scanned the crowd until she found him, Arthur Sterling. He was standing near the stage, observing the proceedings with a grandfatherly air. Their eyes met across the room. He gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Everything was in place. Brian then saw a flash of crimson near the terrace doors. It was Isabella Rossi, looking young, nervous, and beautiful in a daring red dress. She saw Richard's head turn a genuine, unguarded smile, finally gracing his lips as he saw her. He subtly gestured for her to wait for him. The sight of it, so blatant, so brazen, didn't cause Brian pain anymore. It was merely data. It was the final confirmation of his recklessness. Brian took a slow sip of her champagne. The first act of the play was over. The audience was seated. The main characters were all in position. She found a quiet, strategic vantage point with a clear view of the stage and waited. The orchestra was beginning to quiet down, and the master of ceremonies was approaching the podium. The show was about to begin. The master of ceremonies, a jovial marketing director, warmed up the crowd with a few well-worn corporate jokes before turning to the evening's main event. And now, he boomed, his voice echoing through the ballroom, to present the award for Executive of the Year, the man who has guided this company with a steady hand and a clear vision for the future. Our CEO, Mr. Arthur Sterling. A polite, respectful applause filled the room as Arthur walked to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the drama about to unfold. Brian watched him, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. "Thank you," Arthur began, his voice warm and resonant. "It's a privilege to stand before you tonight, surrounded by the talent and dedication that makes Croft Holdings the industry leader it is. This award, Executive of the Year, is given to an individual who has not only achieved remarkable results, but who also embodies the core values of this company: integrity, innovation, and loyalty." Brian saw Richard at the front table puff out his chest slightly. Integrity. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. This year's recipient, Arthur continued, has shattered every target set for him. His work on the Phoenix Tower project has been on the surface exemplary. He has brought in new clients and has pushed our brand into new territories. It is my honor to announce this year's Executive of the Year is the Vice President of Business Development, Mr. Richard Andrea. The room erupted in applause. Richard stood basking in the adoration. He shook hands with his colleagues, slapped a few backs, and made his way to the stage. He shook Arthur's hand firmly and accepted the heavy crystal trophy. The spotlight followed him as he stepped up to the microphone. He started his speech with predictable humility. He thanked the board. He thanked his team. He thanked Arthur for his mentorship. Brian stood motionless, a statue in green, watching the performance. She could see Isabella near the side of the room, her eyes shining with adoration, her hands clasped in front of her, as if in prayer. "But I cannot accept this award in a vacuum," Richard said, his voice taking on a more serious, intimate tone. The crowd quieted, leaning in. "Success is meaningless unless you have someone to share it with. For a long time I have felt adrift. I was in a partnership that had run its course, a situation that was no longer built on the passion and shared vision necessary for true growth." A collective uneasy murmur rippled through the audience. People began to shift in their seats, glancing nervously towards the back of the room, where they knew Brian Andrea was standing. They could feel the atmosphere change from celebratory to dangerously personal. Richard was going off script. He pressed on high on his own perceived power. But true growth requires brave decisions. It requires you to tear down old structures to build something new, something stronger. And I have made that decision. I am tearing down the old and building the new. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Isabella. He smiled. "My future is finally clear. And I want to share that future with all of you, my colleagues, my friends." He gestured towards the side of the stage. "Isabella, could you join me up here?" A gasp, sharp and collective, swept through the ballroom. It was one thing to have an affair. It was another to detonate your marriage on stage at the company's biggest event. Isabella, looking both terrified and thrilled, walked into the spotlight. Her red dress was a splash of blood against the dark stage curtain. Richard wrapped a proprietary arm around her waist, pulling her close. He looked directly out into the audience, his eyes searching for and finding Brian's. There was a cruel, triumphant glint in them. This was his checkmate. "I can't accept this award just as Richard Andrea, your VP," he announced, his voice ringing with finality. "I must accept it as the man I am about to become. I want you all to meet the future Mrs. Andrea, my fiancée, Isabella." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shock and disbelief. The applause he had clearly been expecting died before it could begin. Everyone was frozen. They stared at the smiling man and the trembling young woman on stage, and then their eyes as one darted to the woman in the emerald green dress. They expected to see a woman crumble. They expected tears, a hurried exit, a complete and utter breakdown. They saw none of that. Brian Andrea simply stood there, her expression unreadable. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her gaze locked on her husband. She did not cry. She did not run. The ice in her chest had now spread through her entire being. In her mind, she heard her father's voice, a low rumble from years past. "Never let them see you bleed. Hit them back where it hurts." The foundation. Richard's smile began to feel strained in the crushing silence. He had expected a scandal, yes, but also a kind of grudging respect for his audacity. He had not expected this dead, judgmental quiet. He had just nuked his own life on stage, and the fallout was just beginning. He just didn't realize who was holding the detonator. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, thick with embarrassment and morbid curiosity. Richard's triumphant smile had frozen into a pained grimace. Isabella looked as if she might faint. It was Arthur Sterling who finally broke the spell. He walked calmly back to the podium, his face a mask of disappointment. "Well," Richard Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet, but amplified throughout the silent hall. "That was quite an announcement. Unconventional, to say the least." Richard, flustered, tried to recover. "The future is about transparency, Arthur. I believe in being transparent with my team." I see Arthur said, his eyes scanning the crowd of stunned faces. "Transparency, integrity, loyalty. You mentioned these values. Values that the founder of this company, Harrison Croft, held above all else." He paused, letting the weight of that name settle in the room. Harrison wasn't just my boss. He was my dearest friend. And he had one non-negotiable rule: you do not bring dishonor to the company or the family. Ever. Arthur's gaze moved from Richard and landed on Brian. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. "You speak of building new structures." Richard Arthur continued, his voice growing stronger. "But it seems you have forgotten the name of the woman who designed many of our award-winning buildings. A woman whose architectural genius is matched only by her business acumen. You seem to have forgotten the name of Harrison Croft's only heir." He turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have another announcement to make. Richard is correct that the future of this company is standing in this room tonight, but it is not on this stage. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the person who has been quietly guiding this company from behind the scenes. our majority shareholder and the chairwoman of the board of Croft Holdings, Mrs. Brian Croft Andrea. If the first announcement had caused gasps, this one caused a collective physical jolt. 1,000 heads swiveled back to Brian. Jaws literally dropped. Marcus Thorne, the skeptical board member, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Brian handed her empty champagne flute to a stunned waiter and began to walk towards the stage. She didn't hurry. Every step was measured, confident, and powerful. The emerald of her dress seemed to glow under the lights. The whispers were now a roar. Croft. She's a Croft majority shareholder. He just introduced his mistress to his boss. Richard's face had drained of all color. He looked from Brian to Arthur and back again, his mind refusing to process what was happening. It was impossible. A trick, Brian. The woman who asked his opinion on flower arrangements and dinner menus. She ascended the steps to the stage, not even glancing at her husband or his trembling fiancé-to-be. She walked directly to the podium where Arthur stepped aside for her. She looked out at the sea of faces, her own face calm and composed. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. There was no rage, no hysteria, just a chilling, absolute authority. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Croft. Most of you know me as Brian Andrea. It seems there has been some confusion tonight about titles and positions. Let me clear that up. She turned her head slowly, her icy gaze finally falling on Richard. Richard Andrea is, or was, the Vice President of Business Development. He is also my husband. And as of this moment, he is in breach of the morality clause in his executive contract. Richard sputtered. "Brian, this is insane. You can't. I can—" She cut him off, her voice like steel. "Because as the majority shareholder, my vote is the only one that matters on a matter like this. But your public humiliation of our marriage is actually the least of your problems tonight, Richard." She held up a hand, and a junior associate of Arthur's scurried on stage, handing her a thick file folder. She opened it on the podium. "As some of you know, my father taught me to always check the foundations. So I initiated a full forensic audit of the business development department, specifically the Phoenix Tower project." She looked directly at Richard, whose face was now slick with sweat. The audit revealed a pattern of systematic fraud. Shell corporations inflated invoices and kickbacks. To be precise, $3.2 million funneled from this company into offshore accounts. She then glanced at Isabella, whose face had gone from shocked to horrified. "One of the primary shell corporations, Rossi Creative Solutions, seems to be registered to your brother, Miss Rossi. I assume that's just a coincidence." Isabella let out a small, strangled cry and took a step back from Richard as if he were radioactive. Brian closed the folder with a soft, final thud. "So let's be very clear about what is happening. Richard, you are terminated effective immediately. Ms. Rossi, you are also terminated. Security will escort you both from the premises. Your corporate assets will be frozen pending a full criminal investigation. I have already spoken with the district attorney. They are very interested in this audit." She looked back at the stunned audience. This gala was meant to celebrate our successes. Instead, it has served as a necessary, if public, house cleaning. Let this be a message to everyone. The values my father built this company on, integrity, innovation, and loyalty, are not just words in a brochure. They are the foundation, and I will not allow anyone to compromise them. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, commanding total silence and attention. My name is Brian Croft, and as of tomorrow morning I will be taking my seat as active CEO of this company. Thank you." She turned, gave Arthur a grateful glance, and walked off the stage, leaving a scene of utter devastation in her wake. Richard Andrea stood there, a broken man in a spotlight, his Executive of the Year trophy, looking like a cruel joke in his hand. The future he had so boldly announced had just been annihilated by the past he had so foolishly underestimated. The aftermath of the gala was swift and brutal. As Brian had commanded, 2 discreet but unyielding security guards appeared on stage. They flanked Richard and are now openly sobbing Isabella. "Mr. Andrea Ms. Rossi, if you'll come with us." One said, his voice polite but firm. The humiliation was absolute. Stripped of their bravado, they were paraded through the silent, watching crowd, a walk of shame past the very colleagues they had tried to impress. Richard didn't say a word, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The Crystal Award was pried from his hand by one of the guards and left abandoned on the podium. Brian did not watch them go. She was already in a private conference room, upstairs with Arthur Sterling and Marcus Thorne, the once skeptical head of acquisitions, who now looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. "The documents you requested, Brian," Arthur said, sliding a leather-bound portfolio across the polished table. It contained everything: the audit legal papers for the divorce filing and motions to freeze every joint asset Richard had access to. "Thank you, Arthur." For everything she said, her voice finally holding a trace of emotion. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat. "Mrs. Andrea. Miss Croft. I must apologize. I had no idea. Your father kept your position very quiet." "My father believed in earning your place," Brian replied, meeting his gaze. "He gave me the ownership, but he told me I had to earn the leadership. For the past 2 years, I have been learning, watching. Tonight, I simply stopped watching and started acting. What he did, not just the fraud, but the public display." "It's unconscionable," Thorne said, shaking his head. "It was a gift," Brian said, a wry, humorless smile touching her lips. "His arrogance gave me the perfect stage." He handed me the microphone himself. The days that followed were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The story of the Croft Holdings Gala became the stuff of corporate legend, whispered about in boardrooms across the city. The media caught wind of it, but Brian's new PR team, hired that very night, spun the narrative expertly. It wasn't a story of a messy divorce. It was the story of a powerful new leader, exposing corruption and protecting her company. The headlines read, "Croft Heiress ousts fraudulent exec in shocking gala takeover." Brian Croft was no longer a socialite. She was a titan. The legal proceedings were devastating for Richard. Faced with overwhelming evidence of embezzlement and fraud, he had no leverage. The divorce was swift. His assets were frozen, and the prenuptial agreement he had arrogantly signed years ago, drafted by Harrison Croft himself, was ironclad, leaving him with nothing but his personal effects. His reputation was irrevocably destroyed. No company would touch him. The charming, powerful executive was now a pariah, facing years of litigation and potential prison time. Isabella Rossi vanished. Faced with potential conspiracy charges and public disgrace, she left town. Brian later heard through the grapevine that she had reached out to a lawyer, claiming she was a victim of Richard's manipulation, that he had promised her the world, and she had been too naive to see the truth. Brian almost felt a flicker of pity for her. She was a pawn in Richard's game, but a willing one. She had made her choice, and now she was living with the consequences. Brian, however, did not dwell on the past. She threw herself into her new role as CEO. The first few weeks were a trial by fire. Some of the old guard on the board were wary of her, seeing her as an untested heiress who had just pulled off a dramatic coup. She proved them all wrong. She didn't just occupy the corner office, she commanded it. Her background in architecture gave her a unique perspective. She saw the company as a complex structure. She identified weak points, streamlined inefficient departments, and invested in innovative new technologies. She remembered the names of junior employees she met in the hallway. She listened more than she spoke in meetings, but when she did speak, her words were precise, insightful, and final. She earned the respect of Marcus Thorne when she personally dissected a failing international project he had championed, not to blame him, but to salvage it, pointing out a fundamental design flaw in the financial structuring that everyone else had missed. He became one of her most loyal supporters. The cavernous house in the hills, once a symbol of her gilded cage, was now her sanctuary. She redesigned the master suite, erasing the last vestiges of Richard. The silence that had once felt lonely all felt peaceful. She was not just Brian Andrea the wife or Brian Croft the heiress. She was just Brian, and for the first time in a long, long time, that was more than enough. The morning after the gala was a strange, silent dawn. Brian had not slept. She sat in the cavernous living room of her home, a single lamp cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, a mug of black coffee growing cold in her hands. The adrenaline of the previous night had ebbed away, leaving behind a hollow, echoing quiet. The silence was no longer lonely. It was clean. It was the sound of a blank slate. By 7 a.m., she was dressed in a charcoal grey suit, the kind of bespoke armor she hadn't worn in a decade. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot at the nape of her neck. There were no diamonds at her ears, only small, discreet pearl studs. She was no longer performing. She was reporting for duty. Walking into the executive floor of Croft Tower was like parting a sea of whispers. The news had spread through the company like wildfire, fueled by the breathless accounts of those who had witnessed the public execution. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. They weren't just looking at the boss's wife. They were looking at a myth made real, the ghost in their machine. Brian ignored the stares, her gaze fixed forward, her walk a study in purpose. She didn't go to Richard's old office, the VP's office. She went straight to the top floor, to the sprawling corner suite that had been her father's and had remained respectfully vacant since his passing, used only by Arthur for ceremonial meetings. Her keycard updated overnight by a loyal IT director at Arthur's request beeped green. The door clicked open. Home. Her first act was to call an emergency board meeting for 10 a.m. By the time the 10 members were assembled around the long obsidian table, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were a collection of old Lions men who had known her as a little girl in pigtails at company picnics. Now she sat at the head of the table in her father's chair. Marcus Thorne, the head of acquisitions, was the first to speak, his tone a careful blend of deference and challenge. Brian, he began, deliberately omitting a formal title, this is an unprecedented situation. While we are all appalled by Mr. Andrea's conduct, both personal and professional, a leadership transition of this nature requires a steady, experienced hand. The market is volatile. We need stability. The subtext was clear. You are a socialite who just pulled off a dramatic stunt. You are not a CEO. Brian listened patiently, her hands folded calmly on the table before her. When he was finished, She didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she gestured to Arthur, who had taken a seat to her right. He placed a slim-bound report in front of each board member. "This is the preliminary forensic audit on the Business Development Department," Brian stated, her voice cool and even. "As you can see on page 4, the fraud extends beyond the Phoenix Tower project. I have identified similar patterns of embezzlement in at least 3 other major accounts managed by Richard over the past 18 months. On page 7, you will find a list of 6 shell corporations he used. On page 10, a summary of assets we believe were purchased with stolen funds." She paused, letting them absorb the sheer scale of the betrayal. She knew these men. They respected data, not drama. "Mr. Thorne, you are correct," she continued, looking directly at him. "We need stability. What is unstable is a senior executive who has been robbing this company blind while the board remained unaware. My actions at the gala were not an emotional outburst. They were a necessary and surgical removal of a cancer before it could metastasize and kill the host. I protected the company. I protected your stock options. I protected my father's legacy." She leaned forward slightly, her intensity pinning them to their chairs. "For the next 90 days, I will be serving as acting CEO. In that time, I will oversee a full company-wide audit. I will personally lead a review of our most vulnerable project, the Northwood Mall redevelopment, a project that is currently $40 million over budget and bleeding money. And I will present a new 5-year strategic plan at the next quarterly meeting. At the end of those 90 days, if this board does not have full confidence in my leadership, you may vote to begin a search for a new CEO. As the majority shareholder, I will of course have the final say." "Are there any questions?" Silence. Marcus Thorne stared at the report, then at her, a new grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He had come expecting a tearful heiress. He had found a queen who had just consolidated her power with brutal, undeniable efficiency. He slowly nodded. "No questions, Madam Chairwoman." The title was a concession. It was a victory. The Northwood Mall project became her proving ground. It was one of Richard's pet projects, a classic example of his style, big, flashy, and fundamentally flawed. He had planned to turn a dying suburban mall into a high-end luxury retail space, ignoring the demographic data that showed the surrounding community was primarily middle-class families and young professionals who valued experiences over luxury goods. It was a vanity project destined for failure. The board's consensus was to cut their losses, sell the land, and write off the massive financial hit. Brian disagreed. For 3 weeks, she worked 16-hour days. She didn't just look at spreadsheets. She went to the site, walking the half-finished skeletal structure in a hard hat and steel-toed boots. She pulled the original architectural plans from the archives and spread them across the floor of her father's old office, a space that was now hers. She spent hours with the junior architects and urban planners, people Richard had never bothered to speak to, asking them what they would do if money were no object, if their creativity were unshackled. Late one night, surrounded by sketches and zoning maps, she found the answer. The core structure of the mall was sound, but its soul was dead. "We're not building a mall," she announced at the next project, meeting her voice electric with passion. "We're building a community hub." Her new vision was radical. She scrapped half the retail space. In its place, she designed a sprawling central green space with an indoor-outdoor amphitheater. She added dedicated co-working offices, a state-of-the-art daycare, a farm-to-table food market, and affordable residential lofts on the upper levels. She proposed partnering with the city to include a new public library branch and a small community health clinic. She wasn't just redeveloping a property, she was revitalizing a community. She presented her new plan to the board, not with a PowerPoint, but with a fully rendered 3D architectural model and a financial projection that showed long-term sustainable profit through leasing diversity, not just retail sales. It was a masterpiece. It was bold, innovative, and socially responsible. It was everything Richard's plan was not. Marcus Thorne, the hardened cynic, was the first to stand and applaud. "This," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration, "is the future of Croft Holdings." In that moment, she wasn't just the owner. She was their leader. While she was rebuilding her company, she was quietly demolishing her old life. The divorce proceedings were a grim, methodical process. Her lawyers handled the details, shielding her from the worst of it, but she read every document. She saw the pathetic attempts by Richard's legal team to claim duress, to paint him as the victim of a manipulative heiress. She felt nothing but a cold, distant pity. He was a ghost, a footnote in a chapter she had already finished writing. One Saturday, she systematically went through the house on the hill. She had movers pack up every suit, every golf club, every tasteless piece of modern art Richard had purchased. She had them take the bed they had shared. She donated everything to charity, a cleansing fire of possessions. She turned his cavernous home office, with its imposing mahogany desk, into her personal design studio. She installed drafting tables and filled the shelves with books on architecture and urban planning. The room that had been the epicenter of his deceit was now the heart of her creativity, surrounded by blueprints and the smell of fresh paper sketching. Late into the night, she felt more herself than she had in a decade. The news of Richard's plea deal came via a sterile email from her lawyer. He would avoid prison, but would be financially ruined, his name forever stained. He would be forced to pay restitution for the rest of his miserable life. There was no triumph in the news, no vengeful thrill. It was simply the logical conclusion of his own actions. It was the closing of a ledger. She read the email, archived it, and went back to reviewing the schematics for a new pediatric wing her company was funding at the city hospital. Richard Andrea no longer occupied any space in her life or in her head. 1 year to the day of the gala, Brian stood on a different stage. This one was outdoors under a brilliant blue sky at the base of the gleaming, newly completed tower that had once been Richard's monument. A large banner read, "Dedication of the Harrison Croft Legacy Tower." The crowd was different. It wasn't just corporate suits. It was construction workers in their hard hats, city officials, families from the community, and the entire staff of Croft Holdings. When she stepped to the podium, the applause was not polite or shocked. It was thunderous and genuine. Arthur Sterling sat in the front row, his eyes glistening with pride. "A year ago," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd, "we stood at a crossroads. We were faced with a choice to cover up a painful truth or to confront it with integrity. My father, Harrison Croft, taught me that the foundation is everything. A building with a flawed foundation will eventually collapse no matter how beautiful its facade. The same is true for a company, and it is true for a life." She looked out at the faces before her, at the tower gleaming in the sun. "This tower is not just steel and glass. It is a symbol of our new foundation, a foundation built on transparency, on community, and on the belief that our greatest success comes not from what we take, but from what we build together. This is my father's legacy, and it is our shared future." Later that afternoon, back in her office, the city spread out before her, Like a map of possibilities, her intercom buzzed. It was her executive assistant. "Ms. Croft, the board is ready for the quarterly review in the main conference room." "Thank you, Maria. I'm on my way," she replied. She stood up, smoothing the lines of her dress. On her desk lay not a financial report, but a large sheet of drafting paper. On it, in clean, confident pencil strokes, was the beginning of a sketch, the initial design for a new performing arts center for the city's underprivileged neighborhoods. She was not just running the company her father had built. She was expanding its vision, infusing it with her own soul. As she walked toward the conference room, her heels clicking a steady, powerful rhythm on the marble floor, she felt a profound sense of peace. The ghost of Richard Andrea was long gone. The timid wife she had once been was a stranger. She was not the heiress, the victim, or the vengeful wife. She was Brian Croft, the architect of skylines and of her own life. And as she looked out the vast windows at the city below, she didn't just see buildings. She saw a canvas vast and waiting. And she was just getting started. Brian's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. She transformed from an underestimated wife into an unstoppable force, proving that true strength isn't about the noise you make, but the foundations you build and the resolve you hold. Betrayal was the catalyst, but it was her own intelligence, courage, and legacy that allowed her to not just survive, but to rise and reclaim everything that was rightfully hers. She didn't just get revenge, she got justice and redefined her own destiny. If you were moved by Brian's journey from betrayal to triumph, please show your support. Hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of incredible resilience and justice. What part of Brian's masterful takedown was the most satisfying? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for listening.